Athens, 399 BCE. Socrates has just been found guilty by a jury of 500 citizens, convicted of impiety and of corrupting the young men of the city. By Athenian law, the case is not yet finished. The prosecution has named its penalty, death. It now falls to the convicted man himself, standing before the jury that has just condemned him, to propose an alternative. A guilty man in his position is expected to propose exile or a crippling fine. He is expected to beg. Socrates considers his crimes. He has spent decades walking the streets of Athens, pulling aside its most powerful men and showing them in public that they do not know the things they claim to know. For this, he tells the jury, he deserves not punishment but reward, free meals for the rest of his life at public expense in the Prytaneum, the honor reserved for Olympic champions. The jury does not laugh. Within the hour, they will sentence him to death. Welcome to Portraits of the Past, where we explore the lives of those whose legacies continue to echo through time. By the spring of 399 BCE, Athens had lived under restored democracy for 4 years. The Peloponnesian War was over, lost to Sparta. The brief, violent rule of the 30 tyrants, the oligarchic junta Sparta had installed after Athens' defeat, had collapsed, and the democratic exiles who had fought to overthrow it had returned to govern a city trying to forget what had been done to it and what some of its own citizens had done to one another. The restoration came with a formal amnesty. No Athenian could be prosecuted for political acts committed before the democracy's return. The agreement held, and by the standards of the ancient world, it was a genuinely remarkable act of civic self-discipline. But amnesty governs the law. It does not govern memory. Men who had supported the tyrants, or taught the men who became tyrants, walked the same streets as those who had suffered under them, and the city's anxiety about where the catastrophe had come from did not disappear simply because it could no longer be prosecuted directly. It was in this climate, legally forbidden from looking backward, unable to stop thinking about it, that 3 Athenian citizens brought a different kind of charge against Socrates entirely. The charge was lodged by a young poet named Meletus, with 2 more prominent men standing behind him. Anytus, a wealthy tanner who had fought against the 30 tyrants and become one of the architects of the restored democracy, and Lycon, a public speaker of lesser note. Of the 3, Anytus carried the real political weight. Plato's dialogue, the Meno, preserves a scene in which Anytus, present as a character, grows visibly hostile when Socrates questions whether virtue can be taught by men like the sophists. A hostility some scholars connect to the trial that followed, though the dialogue itself does not say so directly. Xenophon, in his own separate account of the trial, adds a more personal motive, that Socrates had once told Anytus to his face that raising his son to inherit the family tanning trade rather than educating him further was a mistake the boy would come to regret. Whether the exchange happened as Xenophon describes it cannot be verified. It is presented here as Xenophon's claim, not as established fact. The formal indictment, preserved in full centuries later by the biographer Diogenes Laertius, read, in substance, that Socrates was guilty of refusing to acknowledge the gods the city acknowledged, of introducing new divinities of his own, and of corrupting the young men of Athens. The penalty proposed was death. Diogenes Laertius wrote roughly 600 years after the trial, and his version of the document cannot be treated as a notarized original, but its substance is corroborated independently by both Plato and Xenophon, writing within a generation of the event, who described the charges in almost identical terms. On this point, at least, the record is solid. Before the trial proper, Athenian law required a preliminary hearing before the archon basileus, the magistrate responsible for religious offenses, where the charge was formally read and the accused given the chance to respond. Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, is set, by its own account, on the steps of this hearing. Socrates encounters a young man named Euthyphro, who has come to prosecute his own father for impiety, and the two fall into a conversation about what piety actually is, a conversation that ends, characteristically, without an answer. The scene gives the proceedings a texture no surviving legal document provides. Socrates already treating the charge against him as one more question to be examined, rather than a catastrophe to be feared. The trial itself took place in a single day before a jury of 500 Athenian citizens selected by lot, ordinary men, tradesmen and farmers among them, with no legal training, who served as both judge and jury in the Athenian system. Procedure split the case into 2 votes. The jury would first decide guilt or innocence. If they convicted, the prosecution and the defendant would each propose a penalty, and the jury would choose between the two with no power to set a different one of their own. Socrates' defense, preserved in Plato's Apology, was not a conventional one. Defendants in Athenian courts customarily brought their families into the courtroom. Weeping children, distraught wives, a calculated appeal to pity that jurors expected and advocates actively encouraged. Socrates had a wife, Xanthippe, and 3 sons, one nearly grown and 2 still young, and he told the jury plainly that he would not produce them. To do so, he said, would dishonor both himself and the city that was judging him. A man should be persuaded by argument, not by tears. What he offered instead was an extended account of his own life and method, the same one this series has already traced. The oracle at Delphi, the testing of the politicians and poets and craftsmen, the conviction that an unexamined life was not a life worth living for a human being. He did not deny asking the questions he was accused of asking. He defended the asking itself as a service the city could not afford to lose. By any practical courtroom standard, it was not a winning strategy. It was not designed to be. The jury convicted him. Plato's Apology offers one hard data point about the scale of the verdict. Socrates tells the jury that a shift of only 30 votes would have acquitted him, suggesting the conviction itself was relatively narrow. Athenian procedure required the convicted man to speak again, this time proposing his own penalty, which the jury would then weigh directly against the prosecution's demand for death. What Socrates offered in a single continuous speech has become one of the most quoted passages in the trial. He began not with a penalty, but with a claim of merit, that the city owed him maintenance at the Prytaneum, the free meals granted to Olympic victors and distinguished public benefactors, on the grounds that his lifelong unpaid interrogation of Athens had served the city more than any athletic victory ever had. It is not entirely clear how seriously the claim was meant. Some scholars read it as sincere, that Socrates genuinely believed his philosophical service merited public honor and said so without irony. Others read it as calculated provocation designed to make the jury's anger visible to itself. Plato's account does not resolve the question. Having made his point, and acknowledging that he had no significant property and could not pay a heavy fine, Socrates offered within that same speech a single mina, a modest sum. His friends in the courtroom, among them Plato himself, along with Crito, Critobulus, and Apollodorus, urged him to propose 30 minae instead, and pledged to guarantee the payment themselves. Socrates accepted the higher figure, and it was this final proposal, 30 minae against the prosecution's demand for death, that the jury voted on. They chose death. What both authors do record is something stranger than the verdict itself. Socrates tells the jury near the close of the apology that throughout the entire ordeal, the indictment, the hearing, the speech he had just given, the verdict, even the sentence, his daimonion, the inner sign that had warned him away from danger his entire life, had not spoken once to stop him. He took this as confirmation, not of innocence exactly, but that whatever was about to happen to him could not, in the only sense that mattered to him, be a bad thing. Xenophon offers a different explanation for the same silence. In his own account of the trial, a separate, shorter work from the Memorabilia, he argues that Socrates, by then 70 years old and facing the likely decline of his physical and mental powers, had effectively chosen the manner of his death and shaped his defense accordingly. That the boldness the jury read as arrogance was, in Xenophon's telling, a calculated preference for a clean death over a slow one. Plato does not make this argument. The two authors agree on the silence of the daimonion and disagree, in subtle but real ways, on what it meant. By Athenian religious law, no execution could take place in the city while its annual ceremonial ship was away at the sacred island of Delos, and that ship by chance had departed the day before the trial began. The voyage and return typically took about a month. Socrates would have roughly that much longer to live. The core facts of Socrates' trial are not seriously disputed. In 399 BCE, he was formally charged with impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens by Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon. He was tried before a jury of 500 citizens. He was convicted, and following his own counter-proposal, the jury voted for the death penalty. These points are corroborated independently across Plato and Xenophon, two authors of different temperaments and different agendas, which gives them unusual weight. Beyond this core, the record thins considerably. Plato's Apology, composed sometime after 399 BCE by a former student who had been present in the courtroom, is the fullest surviving account of the defense speech, but it is a literary composition, not a transcript, written in a tradition where reconstructing a speech in the speaker's likely voice was an accepted form of historical writing, not a deception. Xenophon's Apology of Socrates to the Jury, a separate, shorter work from his Memorabilia, offers a genuinely different interpretation of Socrates' courtroom strategy, suggesting deliberate provocation rather than principled defiance, a reminder that even among those who knew him, no consensus existed about what he had been doing in that room. The exact wording of the indictment and the specific jury vote totals both derive from Diogenes Laertius, writing in the 3rd century CE, valuable as a record of what later antiquity believed had happened, but too distant from the event to be treated as documentary fact. The popular image of Socrates calmly accepting an inevitable death obscures a more complicated reality. By his own account, his conviction was narrow, and his counter-proposal may have done him more harm than good. What the trial of Socrates asks, and never quite answers, is a question no democracy has found a permanent solution to. How does a free society respond to the citizen who insists on questioning everything it holds, including its own right to judge him? Athens did not act out of simple cruelty. It acted out of 500 individual judgments made by ordinary men who had lived through war, tyranny, and the loss of sons and certainty alike, and who concluded that this particular kind of freedom had already cost them too much. Socrates did not argue that they were wrong to be afraid. He argued that the fear did not justify what they were about to do. 2,500 years later, the tension between a society's need for cohesion and its tolerance for the men who interrogate it has not been resolved. It has only changed its name. Every portrait has more behind it. If you want to dive deeper into lives like this, to discover more detail, more context, and more of what didn't make this episode, you can explore the range of portraits of the past ebooks that are available now. Link in the description and bio. The paint is dry on this chapter, but the archives are vast. Subscribe and return to Portraits of the Past. The next exhibit awaits.